Welcome to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we are joined by Richard Cheimison to discuss what is justice. Tim.
So justice, I'm going to explain why I think justice is either a meaningless or nebulous concept. And to a certain extent, if it's so nebulous, it's functionally meaningless. There's about 2 to 3 general accounts of justice. You can divide them up in different ways, but I'm going to divide up the Christian and religious. And since we're in the West, it's really only meaningful to talk about Christianity. Secular, something like Kant's categorical imperative, argumentation ethics, Rawls, or even Aristotle, the idea people get what they deserve. Or the third position, the position I hold, the idea that justice doesn't exist, it's merely power relations. I hold the third position because I think the first position is technically in the third position, which is the Christian position. Presuppositional Calvinists tend to hold this view. Something like God sets the standard. Like God is sovereign, so you can't put God on a trial. That would be absurd. That would violate his sovereignty. And even if you could have a court, you would need someone capable of doing it. And since God is the supreme being, but based on the way the presuppositionalists, and I would argue Aquinas as well, construct God. God's powerful. And this goes back to the Euphrode dilemma. Is something good just because God wills it, or whether it's God wills it because it's good and just? I mean, does God have to bow to Lady Justice? So I would say the Christian account just falls in the first one, the third one, the power. As far as the secular ones are concerned, someone like Hans Hoppe or someone like Noam Chomsky, the biggest problem I have with both of them, and most radical thinkers, the current functioning justice system, consisting of the police and the courts and whatever you want to say, the higher agency, the Congresses and the parliaments, they're functionally unjust organizations, right? So like take Hans Hoppe. Hans Hoppe's parents had property expropriated from them from the Soviet Union in East Germany. Later in life, I think he got a settlement, but it wasn't a very good settlement. He would say that's unjust. And Noam Chomsky probably would say many things like, Columbus and Cortez and Jackson, they expropriated a bunch of property from the Native Americans. Therefore, the current existing system is unjust. Or in the case of the Vietnam War, Noam Chomsky, anti-war activism, the American was the aggressor power. So the functioning system of justice is unjust. And and Michel Foucault in this debate with Noam Chomsky, I would also argue that Michel Foucault holds the third position as well. And this is what Foucault asks. But I would merely like to reply to your first sentence, which you said that if you don't consider the war you make against the police to be just, you wouldn't make it. And then there's more things, and then Foucault further responds, one makes war to win, not because it is just. And Chomsky doesn't agree with that. I would generally agree with Foucault in the sense that the state views rebelling against the state in this sort of functional justice as a crime. And if you want to go to this higher level of justice, this metaphysical level, this becomes much more nebulous, as I discussed with Christianity, because most theologians will just say, God's sovereign, and so forth. Now, Aquinas and Swithin might get to this to a certain extent. I might wiggle out of this. But in general, I would hold the third position, that justice doesn't exist, that it's mainly power relations. Now, why do I hold this? Well, as Hans Hoppe would point out that, if I'm a libertarian, for example, if I don't pay my taxes, the state can come after me. But then again, you have to pay the taxes to the State Department, to the public schools, to all these other organizations, which I don't agree with or don't like, in the same way with Hans Hoppe as well. And Noam Chomsky would choose different targets to pay his taxes, and there might be some agreement about what Chomsky and Hoppe dislike and like. But nonetheless, on the higher level, justice may or may not exist. But on the functional level, the current system clearly has unjust outcomes. So I'll push the ball for now over to Swithin, and I want to see what Swithin thinks of this and if maybe Swithin can bring back Aquinas or make the case for the first position.
Okay, so when it comes to justice, I really don't see how you can separate justice ultimately from morality in a certain sense. And so I would defend a more objective view of reality, which is something other than power relations, and which I don't think ends up being arbitrary. So how do I do this? I think the main reason that people cease to hold objective moral positions in the West comes post-Hume, because Hume brings what is his sort of famous fact-value dichotomy. To say that something is the case doesn't follow that it ought to be the case. This is contrary to the view held by Aristotle, which was to say that there are substances which have natures, and in these natures they have what you might refer to as final causality, inbuilt directedness. So for example, what is an oak seed? Well, an oak seed is a seed which, under normal circumstances, will have the inbuilt power to become a tree, for example. So the inbuilt directedness of the seed is to become the oak tree, for example. Now, this general view of reality goes out with Hume, and also with the sort of Newtonian physics, which strips final causality and final causality and formal causality to disappear. All there is efficient and material causality, which is there as merely matter in motion. So the idea of forms, which says things are genuinely existent in a different qualitative sense, and the external world doesn't exist. And these substances then don't have any sort of inbuilt directedness as such. It is merely matter in motion. So that's how I think we get to this position in the West, is the removal of sort of Aristotle's four causes, and in particular final causality for Hume. So how do I say that Hume is wrong? Because this seems to be a very common position to be hold. So, for example, Stephan Kinsella always starts his discussion of his defense of argumentation ethics and his similar view on estoppel, is to say, well, we're not talking about morality, we're just talking about justice, which he says is just sort of a logical justification, as it were. The reason he holds this is because, well, we can't go from this for an ought. So he sort of brackets morality as such. And so I think that's a problem. So why does final causality exist? Well, Aristotle or neo-Aristotelians one way to do this is to go back and say, well, we have a fundamental problem in reality, which is the reality of change. So there's two ancient Greek philosophers, Parmenides and Heraclitus. Parmenides believed that change was illusory, and Heraclitus said that everything was in flux and there was no permanence to things at all. From Parmenides, you may have come across Zeno's paradoxes, in particular the arrow and Achilles and the tortoise. And they're all set. I won't go into them, but they're all set up to show that how reality is illusion and everything is really just in stasis. And Heraclitus goes to the opposite extreme, which is to say everything is permanently in flux. Now, obviously, everything isn't stationary. Otherwise, you would never be able to reason about anything, because you believe you were reasoning from premises to conclusions, but you would never actually be doing so, and therefore would never be able to reach a valid conclusion, and so hence would not yield any knowledge. And for a similar reason, Heraclitus must be false on the basis that, if there's no permanence, like there is effectively no fixed content to any proposition, and therefore, again, you couldn't conclude anything from it because it would change, because in the time that you were attempting to reason, your premises would have changed, and so obviously nothing follows from it, and so knowledge couldn't obtain. So, how do we solve this? Aristotle solves this with his concept of act and potency. There are things which exist now in a particular way, which is their act, but they are potentially different. So a ball is currently red, but has the potential to be a different color, for example. And this is real in the world. This is not a description of reality imposed from a mind, but is something that is present in the world to explain change. From this, change exists, and so if you have potency, you have act and potency. Potency only means anything if you have potency for something, and so the concept of potency implies final causality. So I would say that on this basis there are things in the world which have natures, and if they have natures, they have things to which they are directed, inbuilt. So let's say the oak seed becomes a tree, etc. Now, when it comes to humans, now it's going to be problematic. It's going to be controversial to determine what is in fact natural, but this at least gives us some fundamental groundwork to suppose that that does exist, and so it could be developed from there. And in a related point with respect to God, if you take this kind of final causation kind of position, there's no reason necessarily why God's judgments would be arbitrary as such, because you could find a standard of morality as such which is built within God himself, which isn't just purely based on will, in the way that what constitutes a good oak tree, as it were, is not something that's necessarily just imposed upon it from the outside, but is relative to the standard of the, as it were, the oak tree itself. So hopefully that wasn't too abstract, but that's how I would generally at least give an outline of an argument as to why there's a basis for morality as such, and therefore justice, which follows from there.
All right. I had a few things that I was thinking about as you both were speaking. First of all, with regard to what Tim said, I do think that in some sense I take the position of Max Stirner, which is that essentially whatever you think about things or want to do in the specific case, it ultimately comes down to your intention and your ability to cause things to happen. So the sense that power relations are fundamental in the real world and that people have to have intentions and they also have to have the physical ability to accomplish them is certainly true, but it's also almost like tautological. There's really, insofar as you're dealing with intentional beings that exist in the world with each other, that's just going to be ultimately power is everything. Your power to make your family come to Thanksgiving and so forth. So I would start by saying that I would take a much more limited view of what justice is, and I would basically equate it with the practice of jurisprudence. And also the intentions of that, but it's what people do to deal with exceptions in customs and agreements. So if two people make an agreement, they both carry it out, and that's the end of the story. They don't need justice. If two people do not hit each other on the road because they both agree that driving on opposite sides is a great idea, we don't have to call justice into account. But when some party brings to case something that is an exception, and this is essentially customary, and there may be a worked out legal framework with standards and norms or written laws, or it may just be what people take exception to. But you take a third party or one of the parties, in the case of a lord judging between himself and his peasants, or the State Department deciding whether it can be sued and so forth. If you take that sort of relation and then you have that judgment of an exception, that's essentially what the enterprise of justice is how do we deal with these cases where things just don't go, not even necessarily according to plan, but that someone takes exception to the proceedings themselves. And there are a lot of questions about how you decide who should regulate these disputes and so forth. But I think I would say in general, it's almost a cop out. But these are just social conventions. But it's also there is reason to it. Taking justice as an enterprise by metaphor to producing vehicles for transportation. I mean, you can technically still make horse buggies. You could probably produce them in mass quite cheaply if you put the effort into it. But generally speaking, people produce motor cars and airplanes and trains because these are just known to be superior. And I think you're not going to likely see a resurgence of Hammurabi's code in any society that can be described as functional. You're going to see that maybe in ISIS. And whether, that the judgment call, whether it's functional, is somewhat subjective. But most people would not live in those places, even if they could. So I think that's just kind of where you have to judge it, is from your own perspective and sort of what you see as a halfway functional society that isn't seem to be reverting to the Bronze Age. And there was a couple of more points that I wanted to get into briefly. I think that Swithin made some points essentially about the teleology of objects, kind of in the Aristotelian, their purpose and what they're fitted to do. And I think that's a useful concept in that they are fitted to do certain things, and there are historical and physical reasons they are. But that is an abstraction that's for human use. This is a sort of thing that we're interested in. What sorts of things cause this to happen in what cases? And so it's not to say it's false, but it's an abstraction that's suited to human use. It's not something that exists like in the object, or even I would say like with living beings. They obviously eyes can see and so forth, and you can see why this is useful for surviving. But I don't think there really is any purpose to an eye. It just works out that way. Or if there is a purpose, it's because the fact that we're willful creatures, we assigned a use to it, we use them. As far as Hoppe bracketing morality and justice and so forth in a different way, he doesn't talk nearly as much about law, but Mises also really had a fairly he didn't seem to believe that you could argue ultimate conceptions of justice or value. He thought that value was subjective, and I would say that's generally true. I mean, an Aristotelian or an objectivist might say, oh, well, we can make these arguments, and if you had the true sense and you knew this, well, it's like, well, then you would be a different person. So to say different people might have other values is nothing surprising to someone familiar with Austrian economics. And in general, I think kind of a metaphor is like photons don't actually have a charge, but it's not false to have these physics equations as long as you have a qualitative understanding of Verstehen of what they mean in the real world. And that's pretty much what I wanted to say on that. And I think I'll let it either one of you who wants to take it from here.
Yes, I'm going to push back on a little bit on what you just said. Justice. Okay, so when I say justice doesn't exist, to a certain extent, I don't think it does exist, as Mises said, in the ultimate sense. And one of the problems I have with this view, which makes me very sympathetic to Swithin's position, which I actually do not hold Swithin's position, but I think when most people, and I use most people because when you talk about customs, at some point, we have to understand. In this way, I remain very much of a liberal. I'm sort of interested in the way in which society operates. Maybe that's a foolish enterprise to figure out. That could be the case. But Alexander MacIntyre in After Virtue, in this one chapter, he has this story of the Polynesians. Some Europeans show up there, sort of like anthropologists. And they ask them, they have these really lax sexual mores, and they have these really harsh eating mores. There's no rational justification, seemingly rational. And in this, he has, and they can't do it. None of the people they ask could give them a reason. And I think in a similar regard, when we talk about justice, and in particularly the concept which oftentimes floats around the culture, social justice, which is brought up very much by people on the left, as well as the right. But I would argue the left in general, and I'm using this in a very technical way, calls for justice. Noam Chomsky would call for justice. The Marxists have this sort of view as well, although whether or not Marx himself had that view is a question. So when I ask people, like, why murder is wrong, the old school Christians could say because, well, Mount Sinai or these sort of inbuilt directness and this is why it could go wrong. If you want to say in one area of the earth, we just exploit peasants. The other area of the earth, the peasants exploit the monarchs. This becomes a sort of almost like a game, which again I'm fine with that. But then to me it just drains, to a large extent, it drains the concept of social justice of most meaning. And then I'm left in this weird position where when people so take unequal outcomes. This is my problem with Rawls, for example. There's no reason to assume that people would have equal outcomes. So Rawls' veil of justice to me is kind of bizarre. And even legally, this is the critique that oftentimes gets thrown at libertarians. They'll say, well, and this gets thrown at, if you get into the weeds of the anarcho-capitalist, minarchist debate, they'll say, oh, in the anarcho-capistan, wouldn't warlords just take over? I think David Friedman was debating Jan Helfeld once, and Jan Helfeld's claim was, well, if I stole your TV and insurance company X comes in, and insurance company Y is the other thing, couldn't they just say, he's a powerful person, we're not going to return his TV? And that's the sort of claim that gets thrown at libertarians, or more like classical liberals in the current existing justice system. The rich and powerful can use the legal system to get out. But one of my problems is, well, why were they rich and powerful to begin with? This is assuming unequal outcomes. So I'm left with the terms people use, to me, are borrowed from Swithin's worldview, which is fine, but many of the people who call for this don't necessarily hold Swithin's worldview. So if either you want to take that, go ahead.
Well, I certainly agree that the term justice is used in a very nebulous term, and that's part of since this is partly definitional, but that is why I usually just go for the operative sense. When there's any situation where the people involved would view themselves as having that sort of arbitration or decision on whatever basis, and that's what would distinguish it from merely like violence, wherein there's a difference between deciding a murder trial and executing somebody and just killing one guy on the basis of something, even if you would agree with either or both. But I think that you're certainly right that the dynamics of power do play a role in how people perceive what is, right and wrong, their moral and or political or juridical inclinations. And then, of course, sheer self-interest, conscious or otherwise, always plays a role in everything from academia. But at this point, I really think that that the biggest difference in what we take as a view is, I think, slightly more that there's a little more subjective. There's a little bit more subjective rationality involved in that there is, whether it's an Islamic theocracy or whatever, there is some kind of logic that people that do have in their minds and ideas about what is true and what they both feel and think is moral. And the distinction that I would make is that it isn't that power causes people to have ideas. I wouldn't be a Marxist. People have ideas, and it's not caused by their genes or by power relations. It's a confluence of events that go on in their consciousness and their subjective feelings, and those are really not directly caused by these things, though those things do have a progressive and persuasive influence on the actual final outcome, because if you don't respond to tigers, you die, etc. But go ahead and please pick up from me here.
No, I would agree that in the present justice system, people clearly have goals and reasons for operating the way in which they do. But I would make the claim that this is because they have a sense of that something is right and something is not. The Polynesian example that Tim brings up, which Alistair McIntyre mentions, there's going to be societies in which... So the claim that an objective morality justice exists, it does not follow from that everyone would agree on what that actually is. Nor would it follow that all societies would follow that. So even though it's the case that the Polynesian society had somewhat different customs and practices than the Western Christian ones did, doesn't in principle invalidate the existence of any sort of more objective moral principles or justice principles of justice. Because in the same way, well, if someone looked at some mathematical argument of certain description, you disagreed as to whether the conclusion followed or not. I'm pretty sure there's a lot of people went over Gödel's incompleteness theorem for quite a while to see whether it was actually correct. So there's certainly lots of debate, at least in sort of mathematical terms. And that doesn't... Oh, well, I suppose you could take a subjectivist view of maths if you wanted to. But a lot of people say, maths kind of exists in a more objective sense. We don't need to go there. So I wouldn't say that... So people do this in enterprise law because they believe things to be true, and most people don't think it's just their own subjective view as well, for that matter. Even though you could analyze it in those terms. So yes, whilst it's true a value is subjective, it doesn't follow from that something like the good doesn't exist. Because using the term value implies a valuer. Which is why, in this context, eschewing the term subjective value is probably value as such probably is a wise, at least rhetorical move. And just to respond to Richard's criticism of the idea that sort of actum potency and inbuilt directness is imposed on the world by the mind, whilst it's, I would argue, recognized by minds, if it didn't exist in the world, we wouldn't be able to explain change. And I think that's fundamentally going to be the problem. We either have to take the Parmenidean view or we have to take the Heraclitean view. And since both of those extremes are irrational and wouldn't give any grounds for any sort of consistency of reasoning about the world at all, that we must reject them on that basis. And so actum potency isn't just a feature of the mind, it's a feature of the world. Now, what I would agree with Richard on is that when it comes to, in practice, when it comes to the law as such, well, clearly the law and justice systems in jurisprudence is something which is developed over time through disputes. If there's no disputes, then there's no sort of law as such. Because that's just what it is. But my point would be rather that it isn't something which is entirely doesn't have its own sort of in the world direct direction. It's not something that's merely imposed on the mind. By the mind, sorry. Tim.
So I want to differentiate here between just because something is successful doesn't necessarily make it true. So one of the things I do not dispute is the fact that certain rules or norms or conventions are more productive than other certain rules, norms, or conventions. So, take the sort of traditional family model of some variety, man, woman, children, with the standard division of tasks. This has been a winner in the sense that, from my understanding of the imposition, the sort of Japanese copied a lot of Western norms and British norms in the Sudoku period, if I understand correctly. So and even the South Koreans copied. I mean, South Korea has lots of Protestant and Catholic Christians at this point. So I do agree that norms, that there are certain norms that are more productive than other norms. But does that make them true? This becomes, well, what is true? I think certain things like 2 + 2 = 4, that is true, but that's also like a game in a way. And Swithin did bring the comment up about math. I'm not really sure if I want to go here on that point necessarily. But in some level, I would view justice in the same way, that it's just a kind of game. There are certain rules that produce better outcomes, but then again, you have to define what exactly are better outcomes. Is a society that, is a society that has lots of polygamy or homosexuality, is that a good outcome or is that a bad outcome? Well, up until recently, that would generally be considered a bad outcome by most people. Again, I'm just using most people because if you're going to say it's convention, I don't really. If you're going to take the view that law is just like language and it sort of evolves, could the three of us converse with a 14th century English speaker in the 1400s? I mean, languages to a certain extent change as well. So if you're going to say outcomes are the thing, well, we have to sort of know what the outcomes are. We have to know what are good outcomes. And again, we can make some judgments. We might be able to figure out what are bad outcomes. I mean, maybe people don't like being tortured. Maybe people don't like being waterboarded. Maybe people don't like starving. Although it's not always clear, not to be overly clever, it's not always clear. It's worth pointing out. I think it's true that, for example, Holocaust survivors lived longer, and it gave them almost a networking opportunity. Same way with Gulag survivors. And plenty of people come back from war. If you think war is terrible, but then plenty of veterans come back and they, enjoyed it. This was Hitler's view after World War I. He enjoyed it. It was the time of his life. This is actually a very common view. I mean, people like the Brotherhood of that. So even that, we're not even clear what we dislike. This goes back to the human nature question. What is natural? I'm not sure exactly what is natural. So I do tend to think we have to sort of know. I do think there are conventions that create quote unquote better outcomes. So Britain and the United States are good at producing aircraft carriers and battleships. The Polynesians aren't. The Egyptians aren't. But does that make them true? I'm not sure. It makes them successful. But that to me is a related concept. But then is that a good thing? Well, then we have to know what exactly the good is. And to a large extent, I would say we are in the conditions of Polynesians, unless you believe that there's an empty tomb somewhere in Israel 2,000 years ago, or that there's some porch of Solomon. In that regard, but that goes back to my presuppositionalist point. That also has, that worldview to me also has problems. Now that's internally consistent, but nonetheless, what exactly is the good here? So I'll push it back to either of you who wants to go.
Okay, so I had a couple of thoughts on what both of you were saying. So first of all, I would say you brought up Rawls, and Anthony de Jasse's The State deals a lot with Rawls, and it also introduces a lot of jurisprudential concepts that I think are quite interesting. I would also agree and disagree with you both in that I think there is a distinction between things like mathematics, which are pure abstraction. I don't think it's a game. I think it's kind of a necessary property of reality, but applying it in practice, of course, again, requires judgment of imperfect creatures. But I think that mathematics is distinct from this sorts of non-precisive abstractions that we use. For example, what counts as a horse? Well, you have certain ideas about what horses can be used for, and a thing that's close enough is a horse and maybe a better or worse horse for your purposes. But also these relations, I don't think that they are this that there's some sort of transcendent thing, but these relations do have to deal with reality. Our intentions are connected to the world. We are part of this universe. And so we do have a kind of direct binding up with reality, and our ability to do things depends on how our abstractions, even if they're purely functional or if they're more grounded like Austrian economics, either way they have to do with the fact that there are these properties to real world objects. I do admit that it is possible for people to have a practice or a convention that is intellectually is not defended well. Like they would the reasons they would give for doing this are wrong, even though it is useful in practice. But still, the reason it is useful is because of that relation, and also people's ability to explain almost anything is usually not very good. But that is something for intellectuals to do, is to actually explain why these things work, even if it is not the commonly held view. Certainly adversity can raise talents and bring strength. That probably has something to do with our evolutionary psychology and even our physiology. And on Swithin's point as to how we could explain change, I would actually take the view of Guy Deleuze that it was just a kind of permutation of Aristotelianism, but objects all have certain specific properties. They exist in the universe with each other, and these properties affect each other in different ways. And because these properties were not all in equilibrium at some point, they continue to smash into each other, essentially. It's more or less an Aristotelian marbles view of the universe, but I suspect that is correct in some form without making specific guesses as to how quantum mechanics work, which I know nothing about. But whoever wants to go next, I'll pass it off to you real quick here.
Brief response on Guy Deleuze. The problem, I think, with that view is that the properties, why anything actually has the properties that they do, without reference to any sort of final causality within those sort of things in the world, the movements are simply unintelligible. Efficient causality without final causality makes no sense. There is no way of making sense of why it does anything. But what you're left with is a brute fact if you do that. But the problem is nothing follows from a brute fact. So it would render, in my view, the corpus of reality unintelligible. To hold such a sort of a halfway Humean Aristotelian view. That would be my immediate response to that sort of way of resolving the problem. But I'd agree with Tim. When we say things are better or worse, I mean, it obviously implies a standard of better or worse. I mean, we can look and I suppose the general way of the way, Richard, you're advocating things, and it's sort of similar, I think, to the approach sort of Keith Preston advocates, which is, yeah, well, we don't want to get tortured, we don't want to get murdered or whatever, and so we'll try to come to some sort of position which kind of leaves people alone to some extent. But as Tim points out, that's not always what people want. So I think whenever we say something is better or worse, it's always implying some value of some description. And if the value is arbitrary, then in a sense, the conclusion is arbitrary. And so, unless all we're going to say is take a pragmatist position and say, well, we prefer this, and this, what can we get to achieve that? Sort of a hypothetical imperative, I think the Randians like to talk about. If you value life, then this. I mean, so you suppose you could meaningfully talk about it in that sense. But I think that just sort of pushes the problem back to a large question. Although when you do agree on particular outcomes to a large extent, I think that you can get to a decent amount of agreement as to what a better or worse justice system would look like. It's just that I think that's a somewhat unstable position, because if social views happen to change for whatever reason, then that sort of equilibrium is broken. Now, there are ways that you can deal with that, I suppose, and the system evolves to deal with it. It's ultimately an unsatisfying position. Tim, what do you have to say?
I agree that it's an unsatisfying position, but nonetheless, I hold it. I hold the view that justice doesn't really exist in any meaningful sense, because I think it is the case, or it is true. It does not have easy outcomes. I do think the arbitrary values lead to arbitrary conclusions. And then just speaking empirically, in the sense that, or anthropologically, if you look around, if you take torture, for example, and this is something Jordan Peterson pointed out, it's sort of ironic, as much of a feminist society we claim to have, that the 50 Shades of Grey is a very popular book. Jordan Peterson pointed out that's like a huge Freudian slip. I mean, seriously. I mean, if you look at what that entails, that seemingly looks like torture. Now, maybe it's voluntary torture, but then the idea of voluntary slavery starts making much more sense in a related sense as well. And then we can also rethink marriage as well. So people claim to not like torture, but then they subject themselves to it, and they also subject themselves in other ways as well. I think to a certain extent the Stoics end up having a fairly consistent view, and actually some Buddhists as well, from my understanding. They just sort of distance themselves from most human struggle in this regard. But most people don't want to do that. For as frustrating human action is, we don't do non-action. We are out in the world. People choose to have children. People choose to get married. People choose to go to work every day, even though that many of them hold some view that their boss is exploiting them. And that to a certain extent that depends again on values, who owns what, how do we come to own these things as well. But if we just look around what people do, they seem to enjoy torture. And to push the problem back a little further, and this is, if someone asks me, like, why am I not a Christian? Well, it appears that God enjoys sadism of some variety, for better or for worse. I mean, he put a tree in the Garden of Eden. And again, whether or not this story is literally true or figuratively true, to a certain extent is irrelevant. In the literary sense, and this is my problem with most liberal in the general sense, progressive or left-wing Christians, is, Paul tells a slave to return to his master. That's a huge, there goes most left-wing Christianity down the drain. Now, again, people will say, well, that's Greek culture. Yes and no. I mean, again, it goes back to, they put a poison, literally, in some sense, knowledge. That's why the back of the iPhone has an apple bitten out into the tree. Now you could say, well, this is just a Gnostic, maybe he wanted Adam and Eve to go after the apple in the story. That might be the case. But I do think to a certain extent arbitrary values, lead to arbitrary conclusions. I don't have any clear ways to run society. In this regard, I'm in some sense a conservative insofar as, I'll pick what works, but I ultimately don't have any final justification for why I choose to work, and I'll pick what's in my class interest as well. But I also don't think there's a universal class. I don't think there's a society that works for everyone either. So which is why I go back, why I think Rawls's position is absurd as well.
So I'll hop in here real quick. I would first of all agree that we are essentially in an unstable existential position, and even to the extent that I think there are arguments based in jurisprudence, epistemology, economics, that if people understood them might lead them to behave differently. I honestly do not believe a lot of people are either inclined or capable of understanding them. Long trains of abstract reasoning that go against sort of jungle psychology is very difficult to get across to people, and economics is counterintuitive. That's why it's one of the newest sciences. Sorry, I had to clear my throat there. But essentially, I think that there's a problem also with even the idea of some sort of universal imperative, in that I don't think that the idea of values makes sense outside of the perspective of a limited entity acting with its own power towards a particular end, on whatever basis it has in its mind, whatever emotions are going on. I think that ultimately valuations have to be in the context of some entity trying to do something based on limited information and power in the future to achieve what it perceives as a better outcome. I don't see how you could logically say something values something if it can't. There's no action it could take, or it would just, if something is omniscient or omnipotent or outside of a particular being, it doesn't make sense to me to speak of a value. I don't think that's just logically coherent. And finally, part of the reason I have, you mentioned Keith Preston, and the kind of panarchic position, anarchism, I think is the reason that I push it is, one, it is potentially under certain guises acceptable to the normies, but it's also an issue that a lot of people are inclined to boss other people around. Then we have a psychology that's evolved for small groups living in hunter-gatherer tribes, or cities of the ancient world, which we would consider small towns by our standards. And I think a lot of people are very poorly adapted, and they're poorly adapted to know things about the external world and economic theory that would be useful when making decisions on what kind of society they want to live in. But I'll go ahead and let Tim go.
I do agree that we are in an unstable position. I totally would agree with that. I just in that McIntyre book, one of the things McIntyre praises for Nietzsche, and actually a lot of Christians do praise about Nietzsche, is Nietzsche's restless pursuit of the problem. And I think to a certain extent Max Stirner has similar take as well, maybe different. Nietzsche's sort of famous for loving Napoleon, which because he's some of a despot who just, he ceases to will everything under his control. But I agree that we are in an unstable position. And I to a certain extent, I think, strangely enough, we should be glad that people don't educate themselves. Well, maybe we shouldn't be glad. Maybe we shouldn't be glad. If people knew to a certain extent how much the branches were sawed off, maybe there'd be more. Maybe things would be. But that goes back to the what kind of standard, better or worse. So even there, it's hard to say. It's hard to say if what's a better society? Stalingrad 1943, or Tsarist Russia 1876 in, I forget the city's name, or 1860 under serfdom. I don't really know what's a better society. These questions, to me, to a certain extent, maybe they don't have answers, but plenty of people claim to have answers. But if you push on them, they don't really have any answers behind them. And that's one of the reasons why I like the Chomsky-Foucault debate, because Foucault pushes Chomsky into the realm of defending, like, hey, why do you criticize the U.S. as unjust? And plenty of left anarchists would say the U.S. is unjust. But their reasons for saying it, to me, are somewhat mysterious. And if they get the power, historically we have plenty of examples of them being just as violent, if not more violent. So this does have pragmatic outcomes. As far as panarchism is concerned, I in general agree. I'm somewhat of an anarchist libertarian in that regard as well. I would agree with the panarchist project, as long as Noam Chomskyville is okay with Hans Hoppeville, which has a bunch of factories that are producing great technology or something like that. Or maybe Noam Chomskyville is going to actually be the more productive one. We'll have to run the experiment. I'm not opposed to the panarchist project at all. I'm an advocate of decentralization. I think smaller is better. Smaller is better. I do think, to a certain extent, once things get so big, they just become unworkable. Trying to figure out what the just outcome is for 1 billion people. Even the United States, 330 million people. I think the population projection, even without any new immigrants, is going to be like 400, 500 million in 30 to 50 years. I mean, the size of France, I think, as late as like 1820 was no more than 15 million people. So we're thinking about this, think how big the scale of most societies say. They're incredible in terms of population. So I do agree with the Pan-Anarchist project. I do think we need to create smaller areas and so forth. I'm not opposed to those sort of pragmatist goals, but I don't ultimately see some sort of standard behind them, other than maybe the Aristotelian standard. Whoever wants to go next, I'll pass it off to.
I had a.
No, go on.
Sorry.
Go for it.
I had a quick sort of comment, and that I think that it's really what you're saying is essentially correct, and I think one of the largest problems with even getting into that project is the fact that we do have societies of such scale. I think that people in mass society do very poorly, and this is sort of a problem if you're trying to transition into anything else. I don't think if ISIS had been left alone, they would have been lasted much longer than they did. People will just want their iPhones, and that's going to happen. And I think that's a problem with primitivism too, is you will not compete. You will be taken over. But go ahead, Swithin.
Oh, no, what I was going to say was, even if I'm the only sort of objectivist, as it were, although not in a Randian sense, in the room, certainly determining what is good for somebody and for a society is heavily context dependent. This is so there was, I can't remember the name of the philosopher. He was interested in literature, and he said actually that literature was probably a better sort of thought experiment for moral situations than were sort of abstract theoretical problems like the classic trolley problem, on the basis that, well, the trolley problem isn't grounded in any reality at all. It's just, you've just turned up, there's a guy on the track, there's 5 of us on the other side. Do you pull the switch or not to sort of save 5 and kill one of them? He's like, well, where did you come from? How did you get there? How did those people get there? And so he was arguing. He was a pragmatist, but that literature was probably a more fertile ground than sort of abstract theoretical questions, just because they're so under-described. And so even though I wouldn't take his overall view, I think it's illustrative that deciding, even if you know in abstract that in certain circumstances, so for example, it's pretty clear this is more controversial to say than what an obvious example of a horse would be. But there's murder. I mean, you can, you can create a definition which would be, you clearly be able to see that in like all circumstances. Yeah, that's mass murder. It doesn't follow from this that in all circumstances what murder is, whether it's accidental death or whatever, or something along those lines. And moving away from more obviously sort of moral and sort of baseline judicial situations. I mean, the kind of regulation you have from today's mass centralized societies, which basically interfere with freedom of contract and individuals and intermediary institutions doing things as they see fit, is simply going to lead to a society which is not going to fulfill the give you the best outcomes for humans. I mean, the way I would defend sort of a broadly pan-anarchist position would be people in most cases are the best judge of what's good for them, not because I think it's arbitrary, but rather that they're the only people who would typically have the relevant information to make decisions. Now, does it follow from that they're going to make good ones? No, probably not. In many cases, it's just a third party who probably make worse ones. So what tends to be thrown at to those who have a more objectivist position, they're somehow perfectionists, whereas I would say take a more sort of objectivist, non-perfectionist position, and on this basis argue for sort of freedom of contract, decentralization, etc. I mean, in certain sort of like Chomskyville, or if you have like Rushdoonyville, for example, Rushdoonyville may invade an area which had abortion, for example, which is possible. But again, this is just a foreign policy question. When is it justified with a group of people whether they want to invade somebody else and for what purpose? One other thing I was going to say with polycentrism, to get a functioning society, you really do need general agreement on basic sort of moral questions, even if it's a purely pragmatic one. Otherwise, you'll have constant conflict. And I think that's what you're seeing to some extent in the West today, particularly in America, or the Britain as well, is that you have people who have radically different moral systems who simply can't get on because they don't hold the same values. And so it would be quite clear that both sides would be better off if they were just to go their separate ways. And then if one of them is more successful by the standards of whoever is there, then they're more successful. And then they might adopt those policies. I mean, this is sort of the general view of, I think we mentioned on the Malcolm X episode, if you have a black separatist state and that kind of does better, well, then people will move towards it. But if they see that the integrated state or another state is doing better, they might follow their policies instead. Keeping people together against their will, imposing their values to a large extent on them, probably to a large extent is not going to lead to a generally socially desirable outcome.
The foreign policy comment you made about Chomskyville, for example, to me is quite interesting because I think we do have an example of that. Depending on whom you ask, of course, hashtag context dependent. If you ask most the South or even Murray Rothbard, Hans Hoppe, you would call the U.S. Civil War the War of Northern Aggression. I mean, and heck, if you even ask many people on the left, they would say, well, the American Revolution occurred because Washington and Jefferson and Madison wanted to keep their slaves, and they were concerned that the British might ban them and wouldn't let them expand west. So in a way, we have an example of this happening. We have a if you think of the states as constructed, they have states' rights, and they shouldn't be technically different foreign policies. They should be left alone. We had that case, and actually, it was one of the causes. One of the Northerners' irritation was the return slave law. It made it illegal. It made it a crime. This is why we go back to the functional justice system. And I think a slave tried to sue for his freedom as well in the legal system and lost as well. One of the concerns with the Northerners, we just have a person staying in our basement. Why do we have to return them? They paid us some money. So this has problems for both sides as well. Just saying it's foreign policy. Now I do think panarchism is workable more so because it's smaller units, but there is going to be problems within it. Will Chomskyville invade Jefferson Davisville? Who knows? I mean, and even economic outcomes. Again, depending on who you ask. The Soviet Union was great at producing Tu-34 tanks, and the Soviet Union was great at mobilizing huge numbers of people to throw at the Wehrmacht in places like Kursk. So the Soviet Union was good at a certain number of things. The United States had trouble. The United States has trouble mobilizing currently, for better or for worse. And even in the Vietnam War, it had trouble mobilizing as well. So there's some of these sort of quote unquote slave societies do have features. I think quantity has a quality on its own. So even there, the successful or right outcomes don't always have a very just character to them. If you go back to the Mongols or a group like that, it seems like they were quite good at controlling large swaths of territory for a short period of time. Same with the ancient Chinese as well, and the Romans. The Romans had fields of slaves as well. So I am on board with the Pan-Archaeist project. I do think the Pan-Archaeist project would make it more stable. But there's certain questions which we don't agree on. As Swithin was pointing out, and they do lead to problems. Whether or not just having people break into smaller units would answer these questions, I'm not entirely sure that would be the way, but it is a solution.
Okay, so I wanted to say a couple quick things. And first of all, for any kind of society to not just descend into disputes and chaos, you do need to have at least some basic agreement on what people are expected to do and what most people actually do. The extremist ends of that are the ones that are usually the problems for libertarians. Most people do not shoot their neighbors, but some people do believe there are reasons to shoot their neighbors. And if you can have a culture where immediately resorting to shooting your neighbors is not one that you go for, then I think Chomskyville and Northville will often have interstices where their more ridiculous propositions get kind of filtered out and neutralized. So I think that's a possible stabilizing effect, not an answer in an ultimate sense that would satisfy Swithin or, for that matter, Gary North, but something that would, at least theoretically, provide a way for that kind of the societies to readjust their own inclinations so that they weren't having trouble with each other. Whether that we can get to that is another question. And also, I wanted to make two more points. The Soviet Union was really bad at fighting anybody. They couldn't deal with the Chinese. The Germans smashed them because they had an ill-advised invasion plan set up so the Germans could destroy all of their air force. The only reason the Soviet Union was able to quote-unquote defeat the Germans is because the U.S. gave them billions of dollars in gold, massive amounts of tanks, munitions. If not for that, regardless of how valiant and willing to fight with no weapons the soldiers were, they probably would have lost. The Mongols also had a lot of good qualities. They were tolerant of religions. They liked commerce. They opened up a large area that was previously controlled by little protectionist kingdoms to trade. And the same thing goes for the Romans. There are definitely aspects of Roman societies that, as an autistic libertarian, I might say, oh, we shouldn't do that. But compared to what, that's really the question, is compared to what. But please continue, Swithin, or whoever wants to go.
So, Richard, what you're saying is that the USP of the Soviet Union was that they were the best welfare whore in existence. That was their USP, and that's how they succeeded, by being even better than Shanita or someone like that. So yeah, on what I would say is, as a final remark, I think that people generally have, at least in the West, I think in all societies, I think unless you're a sort of dedicated sort of theoretical primitivist, I think pretty much everybody would prefer better technology and higher material living standards. Not everybody, but I think there's a cross-culturally, cross-religiously, and there are certain societies around the world which we can broadly go, yeah, they're better than others, and that there is internal consistency in the way they function with respect to law, that it's not arbitrary, it's kind of bottom up primarily rather than top down. It's not changing all the time, etc. You have sort of legal certainty. That is interesting on legal certainty. I was reading an old article about why the American food supply system was completely cocked up at early days of coronavirus, and they were throwing loads of food away because it was heavily dedicated towards producing commercial food outplings. So you buy things like fast food restaurants and stuff, because I think before coronavirus, over 50% of American meals were eaten out or from not cooked at home. But the type of food people eat out and they cook at home are completely different. And so you have the situation where you're producing like the wrong chickens, they're the wrong size, because that's the whole system is set up to breed them. Anyway, so why is this relevant to law? Well, the problem is all the governors came, we'll get back to, it might get back to normal in another 2 weeks. Well, then 2 weeks later, well, look at another 2 weeks. And so none of the entrepreneurs knew what the rules of the game were going to be to decide whether or not it was worth investing in to change the factory so that they could produce things for home consumption more easily. Because otherwise you could take the hit and do it. But the fact they didn't know what it is, they simply didn't invest. So it's certainly the case that ceteris paribus, knowing what the law is preferable to not doing so, because then you can coordinate your plans. And this is like a point that Ludwig Lachmann makes in his book on the legacy of Max Weber. Tim, you had a final comment.
My final comment here is, I do think there are certain features to the Mongols, the Romans, and so forth. But then this is probably the biggest criticism of the pan-anarchist project as well. And this is to a certain extent related to justice. There's plenty of good things the U.S. and previously the British did, which I think if people weren't so closely related to them, might not, as well as the Spanish as well. If people weren't so if they weren't so recent, they might think of them much more highly. I would not want to be under the occupation authority of a rebellion colony of the Roman Empire. I think I might choose the Catholics or the Americans. And this goes back to people vote with their feet. The United States in general is, I think, the biggest net receiver of immigrants as well. As receiver of immigrants, I think maybe a few societies every once in a while have a 1 year where there might be higher. So there's plenty of quote better qualities about the United States itself, which lead, which if we're going to say nice things about the Mongols being tolerant, then I think we should also say nice things about the British and the former hegemon in the United States that have some qualifying features, which is probably the biggest competitor to the sort of pan-anarchist systems. But other than that, Well, if Swithin has any final comments, or Rick has any final comments, that's...
All I'd like to say is this was an interesting discussion, and I hope everyone who was listening found it of interest. And if you have enjoyed listening to this and the podcast in general, please subscribe to us on YouTube and share this with friends and family. And if you have any comments, questions that you'd like to get to us, please contact us at mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com.